September 19th, 1944, near Ericourt, France. Inside the rattling steel coffin of an M4 Sherman, Private First Class Walter Kowalski faced a simple, terrifying equation. 3 German Panzer IV tanks at 800 yards, and his was the only loaded gun in the platoon. His hands, more accustomed to wrenching bolts in a Detroit garage, were slick with sweat. He wasn't a loader. He was a replacement mechanic, thrust into this role just 48 hours earlier after the man before him was vaporized by a Panzer shell. The drill from Fort Knox screamed in his head. Face the breach, 2 hands slam it home. But in the suffocatingly cramped turret, every movement was a battle. As he turned, his left elbow smashed into the gunner's shoulder. The gunner cursed, shoving him back. The commander's voice was a raw scream over the intercom. The Panzers were now at 600 yards, their long 75mm guns seeking the Sherman's weak spots. Time, the one commodity a Sherman crew never had against German armor, was bleeding away. Walter fumbled the 38-pound high-explosive shell, its brass casing almost slipping from his grasp. In that frozen second of pure panic, with death closing in at 30 miles per hour, Walter Kowalski did the only thing his mechanic's instinct and trapped body could do. He broke every rule he'd ever been taught. He turned his back to the massive 75mm breach. Blindly, he reached behind himself with his dominant left hand, his fingers finding the hot, oil-smeared rim of the chamber. With a grunt born of pure desperation, he guided the shell backward and rammed it home with his body weight. The motion was heresy, a blind, one-armed load that violated every safety protocol. The breech block slammed shut automatically. "Fire!" he yelled. The gun roared, the violent recoil blasting searing heat and smoke against his neck and back. He didn't flinch. He was already moving, his body finding a strange, brutal rhythm. Grab, turn, reach, ram. Second shell, 3 seconds. The gun thundered again. A hit. The lead Panzer swerved, smoke pouring from its hull. Third shell, under 3 seconds. Another roar. The German tank erupted in a fireball. The remaining Panzers hesitated. Walter loaded the 4th and final round of the sequence, his movements now shockingly fast and precise. The shot rang out. A second enemy tank was knocked out. The third retreated into a hedgerow. In the sudden, ringing silence, the acrid stench of cordite hung thick. Walter stood panting, his back still to the gun, his uniform smoldering from the recoil burns. The gunner and commander stared at him, not at the burning wrecks outside, but at the mechanic who had just done the impossible. He hadn't just survived his first tank duel. In 6 minutes of chaos, he had inadvertently crafted a blueprint for survival that would soon ripple through the entire Third Army, turning a mechanic's desperate hack into a secret weapon against the Panzerwaffe.
Walter's desperate victory hid a brutal truth. His Sherman was never meant to fight this fight. The M4 was a masterpiece of American industry, reliable, numerous, and excellent at supporting infantry. Its 75mm gun, however, was a generation behind. It could penetrate about 3 inches of armor at 500 yards, enough for older Panzer IIIs, but the German Panzer IVs closing in on Ericourt, let alone the thicker-skinned Panthers and Tigers lurking elsewhere in France, could shrug off a frontal hit from that distance. German engineers had designed their tanks specifically to survive a direct shot from a Sherman. This created a deadly arithmetic. American doctrine preached that 5 Shermans could overwhelm 1 superior German tank through flanking maneuvers and numbers. On paper, it was cold logic. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the plains of Lorraine, it translated into a gruesome exchange rate. For every German tank destroyed in the summer of 1944, Allied crews paid for 4 or 5 of their own. A Sherman had to get dangerously close, often within killing range of the enemy's superior gun, to have a chance. Crews called it the death ratio. and it weighed on every man who climbed into a turret, knowing they were the underdog in every straight duel. The statistics were written in burning metal across the French countryside. At Villers-Bocage in June, a single German Tiger tank, commanded by the legendary Michael Whitman, annihilated over 24 Allied vehicles in a matter of minutes. During Operation Goodwood in July, British armored divisions lost hundreds of Shermans in a single day of brutal attrition. For crews like Walter's, this imbalance wasn't abstract. It was the charred hull on the side of the road, the missing friend from the mess tent. They tried improvised solutions, welding spare track links to the hull for extra armor, piling sandbags on the front, but these were desperate psychological band-aids. The core equation remained unchanged. In a direct exchange, the German tank almost always fired the more powerful shot first. This meant survival hinged on a razor's edge, rate of fire. If a Sherman crew could get off a second or even a third shot before the Panzer could reload and re-aim, they might find a weak spot, track it, or force it to withdraw. Every second shaved off the loading cycle wasn't just about efficiency, it was a fractional increase in the odds of seeing another sunset. And in that desperate calculus, the Army's own training manual had created an invisible bottleneck, one that a left-handed mechanic from Detroit was about to expose in the most terrifying way possible.
The brutal truth that Walter Kowalski had stumbled upon was a lethal design flaw, hidden in plain sight. The interior of an M4 Sherman turret was a claustrophobic steel drum, barely 7 feet across. The loader stood to the gun's right, the gunner sat cramped to its left. The official loading drill was engineered for a right-handed world. Grab the shell, pivot to face the breech head-on, and ram it forward in one fluid motion. For a right-handed loader, this was logical. His strong right arm led the way, his body turned efficiently in the tight space. But for Walter and thousands of left-handed soldiers, this drill was a death sentence. When a left-hander pivoted, his dominant left elbow became a lethal weapon, swinging wide and smashing into the gunner's shoulder or the traverse gear. Each collision stole a fraction of a second and shattered concentration. In training, this was dismissed as a minor inefficiency. On the gun ranges of Fort Knox, left-handed loaders were simply forced to adapt, their slower times logged as acceptable. But in combat, where a Panzer's shell traveled faster than sound, acceptable was a coffin's measurement. The system, obsessed with uniformity, had written off a significant portion of its own men as inherently slower, condemning them and their crews in the first crucial seconds of a duel. The grim evidence was buried in the cold prose of after-action reports from the bloody summer of 1944. Reports noted loaders fumbling under fire or becoming disoriented during engagement. One tank commander, his vehicle destroyed near Saint-Lô, recounted in his debrief how his left-handed loader had dropped a critical round, the 8-second recovery delay ending in a direct hit that killed the loader and gunner. The problem was systemic, yet invisible to high command. It wasn't just about handedness, it was about ergonomics under extreme stress. The manual's one true method failed to account for the reality of a shaking tank, a moving breech, and the blinding terror of combat. The Army had designed a perfect system for a sterile world. In the muddy, violent chaos of France, that system was breaking down, and men were dying not because they were cowardly or incompetent, but because their bodies physically could not conform to a rigid right-handed doctrine. Walter's accidental solution was more than a clever trick. It was a rebellion against a fatal oversight. He hadn't just found a faster way to load, he had exposed a deadly flaw in the very blueprint of American armored warfare, a flaw measured in spilled blood and burned-out hulls. And his quiet rebellion was about to become a contagion.
The secret to Walter's backward method wasn't genius, it was injury. 2 days before the fight that would define him, his tank had lurched violently under a glancing hit from a German anti-tank gun near Luneville.
The impact threw Walter against the steel radio mount, violently dislocating his right shoulder. The battalion medic, working in a rain-soaked ditch, popped it back into the socket with a grimace and a brutal yank. "You're done, kid," the medic stated, labeling Walter unfit for duty. A loader who couldn't use his right arm was a liability, a dead man walking. But the 4th Armored Division was hemorrhaging men. Replacement loaders were just names on a requisition form that never arrived. Faced with a crippling shortage, Walter's commander, the battle-hardened Sergeant Raymond Miller, made a cold, pragmatic choice. He looked at Walter's pale, pained face and saw not a casualty, but their only remaining option. "You're staying," Miller said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Figure it out. Use one hand, use your teeth, I don't care. But when I call for a shell, it gets loaded." Walter was thrust back into the turret, his right arm a useless, throbbing weight at his side. The next morning, the test came. As Panzers emerged from the fog, Walter faced the impossible. Reaching for the first 75mm shell with his left hand, he tried the standard drill. His damaged right shoulder screamed in protest, the shell tilting dangerously. The gunner yelled. The Panzers closed. In that vortex of pain, noise, and pure survival instinct, his brain short-circuited the training. Facing the breach was impossible, so he didn't. He turned away from it, his good left arm becoming his only tool. He fumbled blindly behind his back, the hot metal of the breech rim searing his fingertips. With a desperate shove, he guided the shell home. The gun fired. It worked. Through the remaining minutes of the engagement, driven by adrenaline, he refined the heresy into a repeatable motion. Back turned, left hand guiding, body weight ramming. Sergeant Miller, watching his crippled loader outpace their previous healthy crewmen, understood immediately. This wasn't a mistake, it was an evolution. He ordered Walter to do it again, every time. In doing so, Miller sanctioned a quiet mutiny against the rule book, betting all their lives that a wounded mechanic's desperate hack was better than Doctrine. The Kowalski method was born not in a briefing room, but in the space between a dislocated shoulder and a commander's willingness to break the rules to survive. Walter's method worked not because of luck, but because of simple, brutal physics that the training manual had completely ignored. The standard drill required a loader to face the breech and push the 38-pound shell forward with arms extended, like trying to shove a heavy box while leaning away from it. This used the weakest muscles, the triceps, and offered poor leverage. When Walter turned his back, he transformed the motion. Now, he was driving the shell backward with a powerful, compact motion, using the strong muscles of his latissimus dorsi and shoulders and bending his arm to create a mechanical advantage. It was the difference between a weak push and a powerful pull. Furthermore, his body acted as a guide and a shock absorber. By bracing against the recoil with his back, he was already in position for the next shell, eliminating the wasted microsecond of re-stabilizing after each shot. In the cramped turret, his profile became narrower, freeing crucial inches for the gunner to traverse smoothly. What looked like a clumsy, dangerous violation was in fact a masterclass in efficient biomechanics, shaving off over a second per load, a lifetime in a tank duel. Yet the Army's regulations, written in blood after earlier accidents, existed for compelling reasons. Turning away from the breach meant losing visual confirmation. A shell slightly misaligned could jam catastrophically, rendering the tank defenseless. The manual cited real cases from North Africa where improper loading led to deadly breech explosions. Walter's method also placed his body directly in the path of the recoiling gun, risking serious injury from the violent rearward slam of the mechanism after firing. Sergeant Miller was gambling that the sheer speed of the method, getting more shots off faster than the enemy, would offset these risks. It was a cold calculation, the risk of a potential jam or injury versus the certainty of a slower load and a higher chance of being killed by a Panzer's first-round hit. Walter's innovation had thus created a stark dilemma: follow the safe, sanctioned rules and likely die, or embrace a faster, unsanctioned technique that traded one set of dangers for another. The survival of his crew was the only validation he had, a compelling argument that began to quietly challenge the sanctity of the printed manual. News of the miraculous survival of Miller's crew spread through the 37th Tank Battalion not via official bulletins, but through the hushed, grease-stained gossip of loaders and drivers. In the twilight hours behind the maintenance sheds, over cans of cold sea rations, men whispered about the Detroit mechanic who loads backwards. Curiosity turned to imitation. Desperate loaders, particularly those who were left-handed or simply struggled with the standard method, began to experiment in the relative safety of static positions. They'd practice with inert shells, turning their backs to the cold breech, fumbling at first, then finding the rhythm. The results were undeniable. Seconds melted away. In the next skirmish, a loader from 2nd Platoon used the method and his crew claimed 2 Panzers, then another. It was a viral, silent revolution, a grassroots tactical update bypassing the entire chain of command. No orders were given, no manuals were amended. It was a pure, organic adaptation for survival, passed from man to man like a secret handshake. For the first time, left-handed loaders weren't at a disadvantage. They were often the quickest to master it. The method proved its worth not in theory, but in the only currency that mattered: more living crews returning to camp. This quiet rebellion could not stay hidden forever. It was exposed during a battalion live-fire exercise observed by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. His sharp eyes caught a loader in a distant tank perform the unthinkable, spinning away from the gun to reload. Abrams, a commander who valued results above all, immediately halted the exercise. A tense silence fell as the young loader, expecting a court-martial, was marched before the legendary officer. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, shielding his man, and laid out the facts: the faster times, the higher survivability, the wounded mechanic who started it all. Abrams listened, his face unreadable. Then he did something that defied all military bureaucracy. He asked for a demonstration. Walter, heart pounding, loaded 3 rounds in under 9 seconds. Abrams checked his stopwatch. He saw the efficiency, the regained space in the turret. The regulations screamed violation, but the data whispered victory. Turning to his assembled officers, Abrams issued a historic verbal order that overrode a dozen safety protocols. Teach every loader in this battalion to do it that way, starting now. The mutiny was over. It had just been sanctioned by the one man whose opinion on killing Panzers mattered most. The unorthodox loading technique, now spreading like wildfire through the 4th Armored Division, soon landed on the desk of the one man in the European theater who valued results over regulations more than anyone: General George S. Patton. His staff officers, analyzing after-action reports from Abrams' battalion, noted a curious anomaly: a measurable drop in engagement times and a spike in claimed kills. When briefed on the backwards loading method, Patton didn't see a safety violation. He saw a tactical advantage. In early October 1944, he arrived unannounced at a field exercise. With his iconic ivory-handled pistols and scowling demeanor, he demanded a demonstration. A nervous Walter Kowalski, now a corporal, was ordered into a Sherman's turret. Patton, stopwatch in hand, barked, "Show me." The tank's engine roared. Walter performed his drill under the gaze of the entire 3rd Army Command. The seconds ticked away. 2.9, 2.8, 2.7. The raw speed was undeniable. Patton turned to his chief of staff, his voice cutting through the diesel fumes. "That is not a mistake. That is a weapon. Why in hell isn't every loader in my army doing that right now?" Patton's subsequent order was as simple and brutal as his tactics. He issued a verbal command that became legendary. Any tank battalion commander in the 3rd Army who failed to adopt and train the new loading method would be relieved of command. Furthermore, any officer who attempted to court-martial a loader for using the technique would answer directly to him. This was not an amendment to a manual, it was a general overriding the manual with sheer force of will. The effect was instantaneous and total. Overnight, what was a clandestine trick became standard operating procedure for thousands of Sherman crews. Training officers scrambled to formalize the once forbidden motion. From the mud of Lorraine to the forests of the Ardennes, the Kowalski method became the norm. The impact on combat statistics became clear within weeks. Third Army's tank loss-to-kill ratio began to sharply improve. Crews were getting more rounds downrange, winning duels they would have previously lost, and surviving. Patton had recognized what the rule books could not, that in the desperate algebra of armored warfare, a mechanic's desperate second could be worth more than a manual's perfect minute.
Walter Kowalski survived the war. He returned to Detroit in late 1945, took off his uniform, and went back to his job as a mechanic at the Ford River Rouge plant. There were no parades for him, no medals for innovation. The Army does not decorate men for rewriting a manual it never officially changed. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet, steadfast life, the rhythmic clang of the factory floor replacing the thunder of the 75mm gun. To his neighbors and children, he was simply a veteran who didn't like to talk about the war. His obituary in 2004 listed his service, but made no mention of Panzers, loading times, or General Patton. In the official narrative of the war, he was a footnote. Yet the technique born from his dislocated shoulder and desperation refused to die. It traveled to Korea with veteran sergeants who taught it to new crews facing North Korean T-34s. It was used in the early days in Vietnam by crews of aging M48 Pattons. It became part of the unspoken curriculum, passed down from tanker to tanker long after the Sherman was retired, a ghost in the machine of armored warfare. The true legacy of Walter's backward method was not in fame, but in a simple, unquantifiable number: the extra second. That second gave a crew one more chance, one more shot that could track a tank, disable a gun, or save a life. Historians estimate such frontline improvisations by improving survival rates in units that adopted them may have saved hundreds of crews. The final, poignant twist is this: Walter Kowalski's name was erased, but his motion endured. In the 1990s, a historian digging through after-action reports found scattered references to a reverse loading drill in the 4th Armored Division. Tracking down a few aging veterans, he heard the story of the left-handed mechanic from Detroit. When he finally located Walter's modest grave in Michigan, he found something unexpected. Fresh flowers rested against the headstone. They were from a group of Vietnam-era tankers he had never met, who had learned of the man who gave them a fighting chance. Walter Kowalski never knew he was a hero, but the men who came home because of him did.